Hey guys, Silent Knight here, and we are going to be diving into what you can expect to see for Lorcana with the North American Championship and the Last Chance Qualifier. What is going to be that meta? How are things going to get shifted up? Well, we are going to be talking about that right now. With the Lorcana ending with a big bang with the EU happening right after set 6 being released, that was an actually really interesting time, mainly because the new set came out and then immediately you had the EU championships happening pretty much the following week, which really was a difficult thing for them to have to encounter because there wasn't a whole lot that they could really do to really test and prepare for that. Well, North American Championships is happening this next Friday, and what that necessarily is going to mean is that they have had a lot of time to try and test their decks, and now when they are going to play in Disneyland, they are prepared to their utmost with the decks that they are taking. But what decks can we really expect to see? I mean, we have a lot of Steel Song going on right now. We have a lot of shifting stuff going around with, Ruby Amethyst. We have Amethyst Steel. We have Amethyst galore and pretty much everything that you would like to see. But let's take a look at what we might actually be able to see with these deck lists. So first and foremost, of course, probably the most relevant deck here that we are going to probably be seeing the most of is going to be Ruby Amethyst. And why is that? Well, it's really interesting because especially in set 5, it was, pretty good in the pack. You were seeing it place, but it wasn't being nearly as dominant as it was with Ruby Sapphire, of course. And that was a very interesting thing because it was going back and forth on trying to be the best deck in the meta. But unfortunately, it was there, but it wasn't as dominant as Ruby Sapphire. And that was the biggest thing. But what was also interesting is when set 6 came out, it really didn't have all that many changes that happened with it. And that was really interesting to see. I mean, you've seen things go around with this where, they added in, a bell. They've added the 4 genie, which everything in Amethyst has added 4 genie. And everything else, though, hasn't really been too changed up. You're still running the Flynn Riders. You're still running the Sisus. You can run the big Sisu. You can do all of that stuff. One card that actually has been pretty interesting to see in the beginning has been actually Moana, not because she can quest or attack or anything like that. Quite the opposite. You're pretty much going to just be questing with her, or she's just going to be sitting there. What's really good about her is that she goes directly into Flynn Rider, because before, you would play a Moana or you would play, your 1-drop kind of thing, and it was a Chernabog and whatnot. You would bounce that. You'd play Flynn Rider turn 2, and then you would sit and wait, and, there was an okay chance that you might be able to get Flynn Rider to go off turn 3 when you play Sisu. That was almost like a guarantee there, but it was still a little iffy. Now, with Moana, you can guarantee that turn 3, at the start of turn 3, that Flynn Rider could have a chance of going off. Yes, there's a chance that, you might see a Smee. You might see a snake, things of that nature. But the point is now you don't have to bring in the snake to be able to get your deck moving. Now instead, you can get the Flynn Rider going off so much more quicker and in a lot smoother fashion with Moana coming in. Now, at the same time, having someone to try to attack into Moana, even when she's questing and things like that, can be very detrimental as well, because 3 attack is pretty much a really solid sweet spot for you right there. Because there's a lot of things that do have 3 willpower that can easily be taken out with that move right there. Otherwise, everything else is pretty much the same. And you're seeing not a whole lot going on. Now, Belle is actually a really interesting one in the meta, too, and I feel like we do need to talk about that a little bit. Especially because, she saw very, very light play in this last set 5 meta, but hasn't really changed all that much. And so it was really interesting to see what they were able to do with that and how dominant Belle has been able to come back in. Some people play a 1-of, but I feel like the sweet spot here with this deck in particular, especially playing it myself a lot, has been the fact that you go ahead and you play with 2, so when you need it, you have that much more of a chance of being able to see it. Now, some people, of course, have been running Elsa 5th Spirit. Now, we've been seeing, or Spirit of Winter. Elsa Spirit of Winter is a very interesting one, too, but you're seeing that a lot more in and Blurple more than you're seeing it here. This is just kind of a special case on the list that I happen to pull up. But still, Sisu also being a 1 of or a 2 of. I've been seeing it a little bit more of a 2 of, and I think it's a little bit better as a 2 of. But it's still doing an absolute great job with all of that. And so with that, of course, you got the friends on the other side. We're not running 4B prepareds anymore. We're seeing usually 3, occasionally 2, but it's becoming very rare on being able to see 4. So kind of surprising there. Really excited to see kind of where this deck kind of goes, because especially late game, you can really start to turn the tide. The hardest thing, of course, though, as anyone's guess, is going against Steel Song. If they just can start going wide right off the bat, then by the time you get to round 7, it's going to be way too late for a Be Prepared. And your removal with Ruby Amethyst just isn't exactly the best outside of board control. You're going to be relying on Fox a lot more, things of that nature to try to get some board control, and that's not going to be happening very much. Now, the next one, of course, is going to be Ruby Sapphire. Now, the interesting thing about Ruby Sapphire is we've seen it really start to fall off a lot on what's been going on with the meta currently. It's not doing nearly as good as it has been, which has been really interesting. And so with that, got your dice. You want the dice? So with Sapphire, it seems like it's really just been a lot slower in the meta as of recently, which has really been hurting things a lot. That's going to be something that, unless it can really start getting its ramp going, it's going to be really struggling. You really want all the dice, don't you? It's going to be really struggling to catch up to the other metas, which is so much faster now with set 6. It feels like all the decks, minus Ruby Amethyst and Ruby Sapphire, have really gotten a speed boost here. And so Ruby Sapphire has still gotten a lot of really good stuff to have going for it. You still have the card draw with Grammatala, with Hiram. You now have the new attribute going in with Maui Half Shark. And he's pretty dang good, especially for being able to gain 1 off of actions. That's something that you absolutely love to see. And going with that, also along those lines too, is seeing Sisu being able to come out. You could even get Sisu out coming turn 6. And again, something like, Steel Song, or, with people that have genies on the board, that can be really difficult to have to face in this deck and in this meta. And so if Ruby Sapphire can manage to get to the end game, it can be dominant on the board and can really take control of things in the late game and just slow play into winning the game without anyone really being able to catch up. And I really do like this idea, especially with this deck. I mean, literally running 21 actions, and Maui Half Shark can take and gain a lore off of each one, which can really add up fast. And so that's just going to be really interesting to see how this is going to be able to do. Is it necessarily going to win? I don't think so. But I wouldn't be surprised if we happen to see 1 or 2 decks in the top 10, which would be something that seems very plausible. I'm also thinking that Ruby Amethyst is going to be potentially having 3 decks that will place in the top 10, and I do think even Ruby Amethyst over Ruby Sapphire will end up taking the win here. All right, guys, so Emerald Amethyst, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Emerald Amethyst, of course, we hadn't seen a little bit of it in set 5. Wasn't necessarily dominant, wasn't all too great unless you had a lot of good stuff going for you. Then you'd be able to go on and take on the game. The biggest thing with Emerald Amethyst is that if it starts losing its momentum, it's an easy win for your opponent. And that can be really difficult for you to have to go through with this deck. And I mean, we did get some really good stuff added with like Go-Go, especially, for example, where there's even times where you might be able to gain, 4 lore for 2 additional cost. I mean, that's a great deal. That's a great bargain, especially late game. The hardest part is, though, especially in the early game, if you get halted on being able to go wide, then you're going to be finding yourself playing catch up for the rest of the game and almost feeling even behind. The nicest part about this deck, though, is it is a little bit cheaper for the competitive scene, which is good. But at the same time, this is still a pretty difficult deck to pilot, especially because if you do happen to start getting behind, it can be extremely difficult for you to catch up. I do think one of the biggest reasons why this is one of the hardest decks to pilot is because of how lacking in removal this deck has. Steel Song, you have a bunch of Steel Songs, that you can manage to play to do removal. Amethyst Steel, same thing. Uh, you know, Ruby Amethyst even has, the brawls in the beginning and things like that. But the difficult part with EA is that it doesn't have the removal. It is more so waiting and hoping that you don't have the removal so that it can take advantage of questing early on to get up in the lore and to get there. Now, is this deck going to be even really well represented at the NA Championships and even at the Last Chance Qualifier? I don't really think so. We saw this really tick up a lot higher at the beginning release of Sail the Azurite Sea, especially with how big Go-Go and Genie were for this deck. At the same time, though, it just feels like that hype and momentum has really fallen off, and you're seeing this place less and less. And this tournament that I pull up for this deck in particular, at 110 people, managed to get fifth, which is a really good showing of this deck. But at the same time, you're only seeing one, maybe two, even placing in the top 16, and that's just something that necessarily I would be kind of surprised if we even saw two that were placing in the top 16, and even like I maybe could see one placing in the top 10, but I don't think it would be in the top 4. I don't even really think it would be necessarily in the top 6. I just feel like this deck isn't quite there once again with this new set release. And I think the biggest thing is it just is lacking removal, and it's still lacking a little bit more consistency with like card draw to at least give you that little bit more momentum shift so that you have more weapons in your arsenal to be able to deal with your opponent's board. Because without the ability to ramp like Ruby Sapphire, without the ability to go heavy on gaining lore and also on removal like Ruby Amethyst or Steel Song, especially with the just questing like crazy and singing like crazy, it's just not quite there yet. And there are better decks out there, especially for the same price, that get there easy. And so this is something that's going to be very difficult to have to work through. Now, at the same time, next deck, we are looking at Blurple. Now, this is an interesting deck, and I feel like it is almost tier 1. Almost tier 1. It is so close to getting there. Why, though? Why is it top tier 2? The reason I think that it is top tier 2 is because it is so heavily focused on the end game, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to really do early game outside of ramping. And the only removal that you have for this deck is either with competitors or with your characters going into your competition, and your characters also having removal or slowing stuff down like Elsa, Spirit of Winter. That's it. That sucks. And so you have a lot better things that necessarily can take things out easier. Again, Steel has probably the best removal in the game. You got Zeus, you got Smash, you got Fire the Cannons, you got Grab Your Sword. You got so many things that you can just grab and go with. That's the hard part, though. Unfortunately, with that, there's not a whole lot that you can really do about this, and you just got to kind of hope that you can ramp up really well so that you can control the end game before your opponent gets too far ahead. Otherwise, that you're going to get lost. If this manages to get a little bit more removal, or something just to keep it into the game a little bit faster, a little bit better. Because especially if you miss out on the ramp, you got to really hope that your opponent's not drawing nearly as good. The difficult part with this deck too, especially in NA championships and last chance qualifiers, is I don't think there's a whole lot of people that want to risk this deck and representing them on a very big stage that they have worked so hard to get to, especially with how much this game is growing. The big tournaments that we have that get you to qualify for the NA championships or get you to qualify for the EU championships, they're only going to get busier and busier as this game continues to grow. And so for a lot of these people who have qualified for the NA championships, this might be really their only chance that they get to play on this grand stage, you know? And so would they dare risk this with, a Blurple? And it's like, I feel like a few would, but the majority of the board isn't going to, again, because there is so much more, consistency out there that they can utilize for, the same price, if not just barely a little bit more. I mean, the most expensive deck in the game is Amethyst Steel. But at the same time, this deck just isn't quite there yet. So the risk of it is not going to be there, and I think, like we've seen in most tournaments previously, you're only going to have maybe 2 or 3 that even enter into the tournament playing Blurple. We'll see. I want it to be there. I want it to do better, and it feels like it is so close to being that tier 1 deck, even low tier 1. But I feel like just with how it is right now, it's not there yet. It can compete with tier 1 decks, but you're almost hoping that you're able to draw well and they're missing a little for you to be able to do really good with this deck. And so we'll see though. But I'm saying like there might only be 3, maybe 5 decks that even show up that have Blurple in that tournament. Now, with that going next, we do have some stuff going here. What is this? Oh, it is Amethyst Steel. Now, this is the deck that I actually pilot, and one of the biggest decks that I try to pilot in the store championships and things like that. And it's interesting. I really like where it is at. The biggest thing it feels like with Amethyst Steel is those who are playing it don't quite know the optimal build to play with yet. Some people are going heavy aggro, some people are going mid range, some people are going, just more on the control side, some people are going just more on the character side, and there's just a lot of confusion on what is the optimal build. We haven't really seen a whole ton of Amethyst Steel, competing in previous sets. We have a little bit, but not in this grand of scale. And it feels like this is the deck to take a risk on when going to the NA championships. We've seen pretty much in every single big tournament since Set 6 has released that you do have, 1 or 2 that are placing in the top 8, which is really cool to see. But it all comes back to, I don't think people have found that optimal build yet for Amethyst Steel, and it is just barely missing the mark. I feel like it's probably the 4th or 3rd deck in the set. I really feel like it's Ruby Amethyst, Amber Steel, and then if not, Sapphire, Ruby Sapphire, then this. It's difficult. It does a really good job on hitting the ground running, but if you start missing card draw and if you start getting into the late game, you're going to really start falling behind, especially if you're going against Ruby Amethyst or Ruby Sapphire, and you start getting into the late game against them and you're not already at 17, even if you are already at 17, and they start playing, the Medusas, they start playing the Be Prepared and stuff like that, and you already don't have the card draw built up, it's going to be so difficult for you to take this. And it's just so hard for you to be able to do something with this deck. I feel like it still is going to be able to do well. I feel like we probably will see 1 in the top 8 at NA or championships. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how this does. I do feel like necessarily the Tinkerbells are a little bit too slow for this meta, especially for what you're going against. It does a really good job at matching up against, cards where you can really start popping off the 2 damage on other characters and things like that. But unless you start getting that off, it's just running too slow. And so that's the really difficult thing about this kind of mid-range deck, is trying to find that balance. Instead of usually running Tinkerbells, I particularly love running the Gantu, being able to quest for 4, especially getting up to 8 to 12. ink or 8 to 12 lore, and then you quest with Gantu and you get to 12 or more lore. That can be a really big game changer right there. He's probably only going to go off once, but then someone's going to be attacking into him, or they're going to be using some utility to take him out, and that's just a great feeling because then they don't have to use that on your other stuff, which could still help you with your board presence, and you already gained the 4 lore, so he's already done his job. And so I'm just really curious to see what's going to happen with this deck. I still think, yes, one is going to be in top 8. It's not going to be good enough to win. If it does end up taking first, I would love to see it. We've seen this being able to take first, especially against NA versus EU. Did a really good job with that. But again, it still just isn't quite there yet, and I feel like this is the one deck that is still trying to figure out who it is. Anyway, one final deck. We are looking at 2 more decks. All right, guys, and so 2 decks left on the list, and it is going to be an interesting one because it is going to be Emerald Steel. Now, this one in particular is going to be going on kind of a quick talk here, just because there's not a whole lot that this deck is necessarily doing. That's the hardest part. The meta has sped up so much that this deck is now having a very difficult time trying to keep up. And so it's like, what can you do? Because even with now playing your Diablos and being able to draw a card whenever when your opponent draws a card, seems great. Feels really good. At the same time, though, it just feels like it is just barely too slow, and your opponent is getting so far ahead while you are trying to still build up your board. The difficult part with this as well is it's like unless you're drawing the correct line to set up your board, you're going to be falling behind because your opponent is just going to be able to develop better than you. I've had people who have gone out and they've been able to play their Hidden Cove, but then they put like their Ursula in there, and while that's okay, it's not great, but they're missing their Diablo that allows them to draw more cards. They're missing their Prince Johns. They're missing a lot of utility, and it's slowing them down way too much. And I really feel like this deck has even fallen back down into tier 2, and I would even put it almost behind Blurple as well. I really don't think that it's going to be necessarily represented well in the NA championships. I don't necessarily think it's going to be placing well. The difficult part is now it just feels like this deck is a little bit too slow, and there is so much that is trying to go for it, but it just needs too much now to get right in order for it to do well. So I'd be surprised if we even see one of these in top 16. We might. I don't think we will, though. All right, guys, and for the final deck, we are going to be looking at Amber Steel, aka Steel Song, and also, looking into Mine Amber. And it's been doing actually pretty good. And of course, this has been one of the decks that have been dominating the, meta for a long time now. And it's because it just has so much in its arsenal to be able to go. This is the hardest deck to face when they go first because there's times when they play the Cinderella and then turn 2, they just are able to destroy whatever you have out on the board automatically and get ahead, especially just with, let the storm rage on, they draw a card, cool, thank you, and you're now a turn behind while they now put out a Pete or things of that nature to just really start ramping or not ramping, really start gaining lore faster and more dangerous. Then turn 3 comes an Ariel, and then they potentially pull even another song, and even Cinderella then could potentially even sing that song as soon as you draw it for free, and it's just such a hard deck to catch up on. The nice part is, though, if this deck runs out of its card draw, or if it misses its card draw and starts running out, and you're able to survive the first onslaught and not have them get super high, then you're in a good spot. That's the difficult part, though. This deck is so consistent, so dominant in the sense of just how it can clear and manage your board while being able to ramp up to 20 so fast. It's so difficult to be able to take against this deck. I really do think that this could be a very big contender on winning the tournament. I feel like, it's going to be coming down to potentially either Amber Steel. I wouldn't be surprised if Mines even won the tournament as well, or Amethyst Ruby. I really think are going to be the 2 decks that are going to be in the top 4. And and, competing for that very top spot. Now, that's the thing with this deck is that it just does such a good job at being able to, ramp well, attack well, and, hit hard for the entire game. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what is going to be happening here with this meta. I think the biggest thing that's going to be, necessarily hurting this deck is if we do end up going into a rotation on sets. I still think we're a little bit of ways away from that, at least, maybe end of 2025 they'll start considering doing releases. This game is actually pretty well balanced that I don't really think that there's going to necessarily be any bans or even limits, necessarily. It's like, because you take Rapunzel out and this deck can still do a good job, but that's a big, draw power that you're missing out on. But also, like, this deck, if it starts missing out on cards, it's just a very difficult deck to actually keep up with. But, that's okay. It does an absolutely good job. And being able to run 17 songs, 16, 17, 18 songs, which is pretty standard for this deck, is just absolutely dominating. And it is going to be a powerhouse, and it's also going to be very well represented, if not the most represented deck when it comes down to this. It's going to be Amethyst Ruby and this deck are going to be the most represented at the NA Championships. I almost can guarantee that. So, anyway, guys, if you like what you saw, go ahead and comment down below, subscribe, do all that jazz. Really happy to be here, guys. And with that being said, I will see you next time.